Welcome back, my history students. Today we're going to tackle the chapter on the American West. Americans began to move westward in the early 1800s. And we kind of have to go back a little bit before the 1850s to talk about how America gained territory in the West before we get back to the time of the course. So going back to early American history, in 1803, the U.S. bought a big area of land from France called the Louisiana Purchase, and that was under Thomas Jefferson as president. That one purchase doubled the size of our country with that one deal. So I'm going to show you a map. This is a map of the western United States during the time of the Mexican War. But I'm going to go back a little bit to the 1830s. In 1836, there were American settlers living in what today is Texas. They rebelled against Mexico. Texas was part of Mexico, as was all of this land in the west here, was all once part of Mexico. And the Americans were living here in Texas under Mexican rule, and they began to have a dispute with the government of Mexico. And that led to the Texas Revolution in 1836, where Americans living in Texas rebelled against the Mexican authority. And the Texans were able to win their independence in 1836. Now, that still led to disputes between Mexico and Texas, because Mexico never really accepted Texan independence. And it all comes to a head in when the U.S. and Mexico go to war over disputed territories. The Mexican-American War was a very brief war. It ended in 1848. It started in 1846. And it was caused because the U.S. made Texas a state. And that angered the government of Mexico because they did not recognize the independence of Texas. So that was a very quick war that was successful for the U.S. And in that war, we have a treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And in that treaty, the U.S. was able to gain all of this land to the west, including what today is California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado. That's my puppy in the background scratching at the floor. Just ignore him. And that's how the U.S. expanded to the Pacific Ocean and really expanded from sea to sea. Now, this map doesn't show Oregon. However, I will just mention that in 1846, the U.S. and England signed a treaty in which the U.S. gained the territory of Oregon and settled the border there at the 49th parallel, because that had been disputed territory for a long time. So it was in the 1840s that the United States continued to expand westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately for Mexico, in 1848, gold was discovered in Northern California. And that led to the next year, the 1849 gold rush in Northern California. In the gold rush, around 80,000 people in 1849 rushed to California because they all thought they were going to become rich overnight. Half of those people came from the U.S., and half of those people came from places all around the world. They were people from Asia, South America, Europe, who came to California thinking they were going to become millionaires overnight in the gold rush. Most of those people did not find enough gold to become wealthy. Very few became very wealthy in the gold rush. But the gold rush lasted from 1849 until the 1860s, really. And the legacy of the gold rush isn't that people became millionaires overnight, because that didn't happen. But the legacy of the gold rush was that a lot of those people who came for gold ended up settling in the West and helping to develop the West. So all of those gold rushers ended up opening businesses, buying land, and helping to develop California and settling in California. So the population of California rose very quickly, and not only California, but other Western territory. So that's how the West was able to populate pretty quickly. Now, the other thing, and I'm going to put the outline back up. Oh, one other thing I forgot. The 80,000 people who rushed to California in 1849 were nicknamed the 49ers. So you've heard of the 49ers football team in Northern California, right? That's the San Francisco football team. Why are they called the 49ers? It's an ode to the gold rushers who flew to Northern California in 1849 and helped to populate Northern California. All right, so let's look at the West after the 1850s. After the 1850s, the U.S. government began to encourage people to move out west and develop the land. The more the land out west was developed, the wealthier our nation becomes, the more businesses that the government can tax, and the more development we have in our country. So the government wanted to encourage westward expansion, and they did so through various laws. I'm not going to go over all the laws here, but let's look at some highlights. During the Civil War, in 1862, the government passed the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act gave Americans 160 acres of land in the West. And that land was free. You didn't have to pay for it. But you had to develop or farm the land within 5 years. What do you think would happen if people did not develop the land? The government would take it back and give it to somebody else who can develop the land. So it sounds to us today like, wow, how lucky were people back in the 1800s they could get 160 free acres of land from the government. It wasn't all it was cracked up to be. You needed money to make that land successful. A lot of work to get those homesteads to be fruitful. Another law the government passed a little later in 1873 was the Timber Culture Act. That also gave 160 acres to anyone who would move to the West, and you had to agree to plant trees on a quarter of the acres. So you had to plant trees on a quarter of the land in order to keep the land. Now you might wonder, why would the government want people to plant trees? Well, the land that was given out in the Timber Culture Act was arid land that did not have a lot of trees. And a lot of it was dry, desert-type land. So the government thought, falsely, that if you plant trees in a dry area that doesn't get a lot of rainfall, the trees will cause more rain to happen. It will affect the climate. Now, we know that's a false idea, but in the 1800s they didn't know that, and that's why the government wanted people to plant trees in their land out west to cause more rainfall. So that's the Timber Culture Act. In 1877, we have the Desert Land Act. Now, this was selling land for very cheap in the West. So under the Desert Land Act, you could buy up to 640 acres of land for $1.25 an acre. So that was pretty cheap even back then. But you had to irrigate the land, and that land was in the desert, so it wasn't easy to irrigate. It's not always easy to irrigate in the desert. These laws were designed to encourage Americans to move out west and develop the land. And a lot of people moved out west to start farms or raise cattle or start ranches. However, it was very difficult to succeed out west. And there are a few reasons why it was difficult to succeed out west. Number one, not many trees in the West. Why would we need trees? If you're moving to the West and you're starting a new homestead, why would you need trees? Well, trees provide timber that you need to build your house. You need to build your barn to house your livestock. You need trees to build fences. All of that requires trees. Now, if you move to an area in the desert, for example, where there are no forests anywhere nearby, you would have to ship in timber, which is very, very expensive, in order to build your house and build your fencing and everything else that you needed. So that cost a lot of money for homesteaders and cost a lot of homesteaders to go out of business. Now, one thing I will mention is that the invention of barbed wire in 1874 did make things easier because you could put fencing up to keep your livestock in, and that required less wood because you would just use posts and then you could run wire and keep the cattle in where you wanted them to be housed. The other challenge with westward living was the lack of water. If you lived in the Midwest or West, oftentimes that area faces terrible droughts where it won't rain for months, and that will kill crops. It also was difficult to irrigate in some areas, so very difficult to irrigate the land. So that made it very difficult to farm. It made it difficult to raise animals. Lack of water can kill a homestead. So that was some of the difficulties the homesteaders faced. By 1900, 2/3 of all the homesteaders failed and moved back east. So 2/3 of them failed and went back home after a try at living out west. Let's talk about the railroads and the West. By the mid-1800s, it was clear that the future of transportation in the U.S. was a railroad. Railroads were used to ship goods. It was a means of travel. And railroad construction in the U.S. peaked between the years 1881 and 1890. That was the height of railroad construction. Now, we already had quite a bit of railroad track laid in the East, but there is an explosion of focus on railroad building in the West. The U.S. government helped railroad companies build the railroad by giving them land grants. You know, if the railroad companies had to buy all of the land that they laid their track on, they would be out of business. It would cost so much money just to build the tracks. So the government would give land grants to the railroad companies where they put the tracks down. And in the end, the railroads would give the U.S. government a discount to ship goods or to use the railroad. And that is how the railroad was able to be developed very quickly in the late 1800s, was through those land grants. In the end, the U.S. government gave around 130 million acres of land to railroad companies so that they could lay the tracks down, especially out west. The first railroad that spanned the country, called the Transcontinental Railroad, was complete on May 10, 1869, and it joined two railroad companies, the Union and Pacific Railroad Company. So it joined their railroad tracks. Now, many of the railroad companies in the West used Chinese immigrants to build the railroads. On the East Coast, immigrants from Europe helped to build the railroads. But on the West Coast, it was a lot of Chinese laborers. So let's talk a little bit about Chinese immigration. I'm going to do a whole chapter on immigration later, but let me talk about the Chinese since we're talking about the railroad. In 1868, the U.S. and China made a treaty called the Burlingame Treaty that encouraged Chinese immigrants to come to the U.S. It gave Chinese immigrants protection under U.S. law. It was supposed to prohibit discrimination against them, and it led to many Chinese immigrants coming to the U.S. A lot of them ended up in California, and many of them worked in the railroad industry. They worked in the mining industry. Those were the two big industries that Chinese immigrants worked in the West. Many of them worked for the Central Pacific Railroad Company to build the railroad through the West in California. That was very dangerous and difficult work for very little pay. And unfortunately, there was a lot of discrimination against the Chinese immigrants. White laborers viewed the Chinese immigrants as a threat. They felt that they were bringing wages down. They were willing to work longer hours for less pay, and that angered white laborers. And there often were violent riots that would break out over these tensions between the white workers and the Chinese workers. So there were a lot of tensions in California between the Chinese laborers and the white laborers. Now, I am going to get more into immigration in a later chapter, but that's where I will end this video, a little bit on how the West was expanded, and then we're going to look into the industrialization of America in the next video. So see you then.